So for the very last talk, we have George Pavlidis and Tom Chortia talking about contactless payments.
Cool. Thanks a lot for sticking around till the end of the day. This talk is about the protocols used when you make a payment by tapping your card and phone and how they're insecure. It's joint work with Joanna and Anna, who unfortunately can't be here. So I'm going to give you a very quick introduction to how these protocols work. Then I'm going to talk about some older work which motivated this paper. Then I'm going to hand over to George to tell you about the extra features in EMV we look at. So the EMV payment spec is big. It's 15 books, and when I say books, I mean books. It's thousands and thousands of pages. There are 8 different companies, each make their own tweaks, each make their own version. There's Contact, there's Contactless, there's a lot, but luckily most of this is in a public spec, which we look at. But as we'll see later, there's quite a lot which isn't in the spec, and that's where the problems come in. Something else I've got to address, particularly for an American audience, is these payment cards work differently around the world. In most of the world, they're very locked down. If you make a contact card payment, you have to type in your PIN. I'm quite shocked to come to the US and put my card in and not be asked for a PIN. If you go above a certain limit, maybe around $100 with contactless, you must authenticate. Face ID, PIN number. Now this is because getting a refund in most of the rest of the world is extremely difficult. If someone steals your card, in the UK, for instance, the banks will just say, you're liable for that. You own that, we're not refunding it. So it's quite a different model. And a lot of the attacks we present are ways of bypassing this authentication, which I realize means less to an American audience because you don't have this authentication in your bank refunds. So with that in mind, let's take a look at how the protocols actually work. They're big, complex protocols. I don't expect everyone to understand these slides because there's so many fields and so many moving parts. Full details are in our paper. This is Visa's protocol, and when you touch your card to the reader starts with a fixed hello message, an ASCII string, just saying, what kind of card are you? And Visa says, I'm a Visa card. So then the reader says, I can do Visa cards, please start the Visa protocol. And the card replies with a list of data it needs to complete the transaction. This is typically things like the amount of the transaction, the currency, the date, a unique number to guarantee freshness. The reader sends all this data to the card, and the card has a cryptographic key which is uniquely shared with the bank. So every single bank card in existence has a unique key which the corresponding bank knows. And the card generates a session key and generates a cryptographic MAC across that data, and that MAC is the proof of payment. If the shop can send a MAC to the bank, it gets the money. So that cryptographic MAC, VAC, and a lot of other data for fraud protection and identification is sent to the reader and then on to the bank. The bank carries out fraud checks. It uses cryptography to check that MAC. It checks the balance, and if all that checks out, it sends an authorization signal to the reader. So that's what happens in literally milliseconds when you touch your card to a reader. Some readers, you might have noticed 4 lights across the top. That's actually the 4 stages of this transaction. So that's how Visa Online works. Yep.
There is no signature, just a MAC, yes.
1 minute. That is how Visa Online works. For offline, the reader cannot check the MAC because it doesn't have the key. So for offline, there is a signature.
Before you go further, is there any authentication of the reader?
No. Readers are totally unauthenticated. At this, between the reader and the bank, there is. But, so I'm eating into George's time, so I'll go quickly. Particularly This track2 data includes your credit card number. So anyone can read.
Give to anybody.
Yeah, anyone can read your credit card number contactlessly through your wallet, through your bag. They can't get the CVV code. They can get the credit card number. In some countries, this includes your name as well. Okay. Offline makes strong use of this TTQ field, which is a risk profile. And in this field, the reader will say, I consider this a high amount of money or a low amount of money. The actual amount value is not looked at because it's got to work in different currencies. In some currencies, 10,000 is not a big amount of money. In other countries, it is. So there's a risk profile which is sent. And in offline mode, to answer your question, there's a signature which the reader can verify. So this provides offline verification for the reader. And there's also this risk profile field, which is also in the online version, is used heavily in offline. And in this risk profile field, the card will say, or the phone may say, I checked Face ID, which means the reader might trust it more. Or I've done no authentication at all, but you should accept a signature, for instance. In the offline version, there are also certificates, which can be read from the card and verified by the shop reader that it's a valid card. That's what Visa's offline protocol looks like. Again, full details in our paper. Mastercard is slightly different. Mastercard does things in a different order. It reads the certificate first. It uses a generate AC command rather than a GPO command. Small tweaks, but a very similar protocol. Okay, so that's what we learnt from the EMV spec. I briefly want to talk about some older work which motivates this. And we've been looking at the spec, and then we read about the transport gates in London, which had an extra feature whereby you didn't need to use Face ID or Touch ID on your phone to use the gates. This meant you could get through them really, really quickly. And this is actually now in most transit systems in the world. This was super interesting to us because it's not in the spec. We'd looked through those thousands and thousands of pages. There's nothing about this, which makes it very, very interesting. And there was no documentation from Apple. Apple were given no information away about how they did this. So of course we wanted to look at it. So Andrea, a postdoc in our group, went down to London, used one of these devices called a Proxmark, and spied on all of the wireless communications between the phone and the card. So we figured out exactly how it worked. And what we found was a complete trace of a raw signal. And here, in the initial handshake, the ISO 1443 handshake, the lower layer, there were these mystery bytes, which are not in any spec document anywhere in the world. We later learned from a patent application that this is called Apple Advanced Polling, and it's a way to unlock an iPhone in a sandboxed mode to run a particular application. And these bytes start up the payment app in a sandboxed mode, bypassing the lock screen. There are other restrictions. There had to be a particular TTQ message, there had to be a particular risk profile. But what we found is that these weren't enough to restrict payments to transport terminals. So an attacker with a locked iPhone could broadcast these magic bytes, and the reader would start up and it would say, we do a transaction for $10,000. The reader would say, this is a high security transaction, and I'm a shop reader. We'd man in the middle of a connection, and we'd change the risk profile to lie and say, I'm a transit reader, and this is a low amount of money. The card would happily create the AC, and it would send back a risk profile itself saying, I've done no authentication. Don't trust me. But we would change that to say, I have done Face ID. This signature would be signed by the card to say, I believe it's a low amount of money and I have not checked it, but that signature is offline only, but the shop readers run in online. So the shop reader doesn't expect the signature and we just drop it. And that gives us a way to bypass security on any locked phone. Here's a little demo. Here we have a locked iPhone. Andrea here is ringing up £1,000, about $1,400 on a shop reader. Phone remains locked. There's a prox mark under it, broadcasting those magic bytes. We relay. Phone remains locked. Transaction goes through. Because the reader is telling the bank Face ID was used, it bypasses all anti-fraud checks. And it's great Andrea did that. That completely emptied her bank account. The fraud checks do not apply because Face ID tells the bank it doesn't need to do that.
Is the actual unlock code part of the patent, or did you have to?
No, we had to actually go, and it's different.
To listen.
It's different on buses to London Underground to San Francisco Underground. Disclosure to Apple, of course we disclosed this. We waited months and Apple told us it didn't work. So we sent them that video and said it did work. Again, we waited several weeks and Apple told us anti-fraud checks would mean it was reversed. We sent them our bank account statements and proved it did work, and transaction numbers so they could find it in the system. After that, they got back to us very quickly. We had a call with Apple's head of payment security, a great conference call in which they explained in great detail it's entirely Visa's fault. Just to be clear, this works on Apple with Visa. If you have Apple with Visa and transport mode, this works on your phone right now. It doesn't work with Apple and Mastercard. It doesn't work with Google Pay and Visa. Disclosure to Visa. Visa said you had to have be in the same proximity as the victim. Well, yes, that is the attack. Yes. They said you had to work in collusion with the merchant. That's completely untrue. Finally, they said, we don't care, we'll refund this. Yep.
Does Apple Transport also work with MasterCard? So this London-specific feature?
It does. MasterCard verify the Face ID in a different way, as you'll see in a minute. So in that respect, MasterCard's protocol is better. OK, so this remains live. Neither company took responsibility for it. It is a live attack which works today. So this, and what became clear is Apple did not know how Visa's back-end checks worked. And Visa did not know how Apple Transport Mode worked. None of this was in the EMV spec, which got us thinking about who else is doing this? How many other companies are implementing their own features on EMV? And this is where George's work comes in. And I'll hand over to George to tell you about what else he found.
Thank you, Tom. So I assume the mic works? Yeah, OK. So as Tom said, Apple implemented a proprietary feature, and this led to an attack. The thing, though, is that it's not just Apple that has those proprietary features. Here we see the EMV parties that work together when an EMV transaction takes place. Over the years, a number of these parties have implemented their own proprietary features. However, are those black box features secure? So in this work, we have identified, investigated, and reverse engineered a number of those proprietary features by a range of parties. And we have found that subtle interactions and mismatches between them lead to vulnerabilities. We have also systematically categorized our attacks based on their root cause, which can be flawed technical specification, non-compliance with technical specification, or bad implementation. Each attack belongs to one or more of those categories. Examples of those proprietary features include some offline terminals allowing the use of only mobile wallets to make transactions offline, mobile wallets supporting the use of loyalty cards instead of just credit or debit cards via the use of the VAS protocol, And as Tom mentioned, mobile wallets have the ability to do transport mode transactions, which are essentially low-value, unauthenticated payments on transportation means. Before we get into our attacks, let's cover a quick background. All EMV contactless transactions do not require cardholder verification unless some limits are exceeded. And those limits are a per transaction limit, which is £100 in the UK, or a cumulative limit, which is £200 per day. These limits vary by region. And if any of those limits is exceeded, then a cardholder verification method kicks in to verify that the cardholder is indeed the legitimate owner. Such a verification method can be either a signature, a PIN, or SYN-DCVM. SYN-DCVM essentially means that the payment device has authenticated the user's identity. For example, SYN-DCVM will be used when you use your phone to pay and you first use Face ID or fingerprint to authenticate the transaction. We refer to payments that exceed the aforementioned limit and require a verification method as high-value payments, whereas those that are below the limits and do not require any verification method as low-value payments. Offline terminals are terminals that are able to make transactions without having an active internet connection at the time of the transaction. Their use is proliferating, with more and more merchants using them in areas with poor connectivity, such as airplanes and pop-up shops in remote locations. The security of payments with online terminals has been researched thoroughly, but the security of payments with offline terminals is much less researched. In fact, this work is focused on the security of payments with offline terminals, and is in fact the first practical study of offline contactless payments security. Here we see actually a simplified version of the EMV protocol that Tom showcased before. The important things to note is that during the offline phase, when the terminal is offline and it transacts with the card sends an AC and an SDND. The AC contains the card's view of the transaction and it's encrypted with a symmetric key not only to the card and the bank, as Tom said. And the SDND is a signature with transaction data that the terminal can and should verify. Now, assuming in this offline phase the transaction was accepted by the terminal, when the terminal connects to the internet, it sends the AC to the bank in order to make further checks and make the final decision about whether everything is okay and the transaction can be accepted or not. In our experimentation, one of the terminals we used is the Square terminal. That's a terminal capable of working offline, created by the company Square, which is one of the leaders in the market of terminals. Our terminal is registered in the UK, and according to its specification and business rules, it's configured to allow contactless payments offline only with the mobile wallets of Apple Pay and Google Pay. It doesn't work with regular contactless cards. However, the EMV specification does not define a way to distinguish between a card and a mobile device. So the question is, how does Square do it, and can we bypass this check? During our experimentation, we compared a successful trace between a mobile device and a failed trace of a card transaction. We noticed that the terminal was introducing some initial VAS protocol messages before the actual EMV messages. The VAS protocol is a protocol used in order to allow the use of loyalty cards instead of mobile wallets. So mobile devices know how to reply to such messages, but cards do not. Therefore, they reply with an error. This way, we speculated that this is what enables the terminal to distinguish if it's talking with a card or a mobile device. We went on to investigate this, and we found a way to actually bypass this by acting as a man-in-the-middle attacker and essentially replaying a legitimate VAS response when we use a card instead of forwarding the card's error message. We then simply relay the rest of the communication between the card and the terminal, and the transaction completes successfully. This might not seem like a very impactful attack at the moment, but it shows that a proprietary feature, this mobile-only offline check using the VAS protocol, led to an attack against the terminal specification, and it also acts as a stepping stone for far more serious attacks, as we will see next. This is a mind map that shows how reverse engineering proprietary features and seeing how they interact leads to attacks. The yellow boxes represent related work. The orange boxes, it's our experiments. Together, they help us understand new concepts about EMV, which is the blue boxes. And with that new understanding, we find attacks, which are the red boxes. Possibly one of the most important attacks is the attack against a MasterCard card we found. During this attack, we're able to make high-value, unauthenticated transactions with the MasterCard card. As an attacker, the only thing we need to do is to replay that recorded fast response to bypass the mobile-only check. And then the transaction just gets accepted. We found that the reason for this is because, as we're the first to find out, MasterCard makes the decision about whether a contactless transaction needs verification at the backend system. But since we tricked this card into working in an offline setting, this backend system is not reachable. So the transaction just goes through without any authentication taking place. So this is another example of how a proprietary out-of-spec decision by MasterCard to have this check in the backend without informing the rest of the stakeholders leads to a very serious attack. Our recommended fix to Square, in order to be able to more robustly distinguish between a card and a terminal, between a card and a mobile device, is to check the AIP. The AIP is a field that indicates if the payment device is capable of performing user authentication or not. Thus, it can indicate if it's a card or a mobile device. It is also included in the card certificate, so it cannot be modified by an active man-in-the-middle attacker. Following this recommendation, Square can and does indeed stop all of our attacks shown in the previous slide. Now, since EMV is highly complex with a lot of features interacting, we wanted to make sure that this is indeed a valid attack. So we extended existing models of the EMV protocol and the Tamarin prover in order to see how the newly reverse engineered features interact with each other and verify that our proposed fix is indeed valid and secure. Square had been very cooperative throughout the whole disclosure process. They implemented our recommended fix. They asked us to verify it before rolling it out to the general public. And they were even generous enough to award us a bounty of $5,000 for disclosing the discovered vulnerabilities. After Square updated their firmware, we investigated security again. And we noticed that it stopped advertising offline functionality for that terminal inside its TTQ and started advertising something called offline data authentication for online authorizations, or offline for online for short, which is one of the flags used by transport terminals. And as we mentioned before, mobile wallets in transport mode can perform payments without any authentication. So you can see where this is going. So with this in mind, we went on to see if we can make any fraudulent payments using mobile devices. And we found that we can do a lot of those attacks. A noteworthy attack is that we can use a locked phone with Google Pay and Visa to make high-value unauthenticated transactions. There is no authentication required on the terminal and no authentication required on the phone. And the reason for this is because the terminal started advertising a misleading TTQ functionality, which was not exactly wrong according to the specifications, but it was kind of misleading, combined with the fact that Google Pay was relying on only that TTQ value to decide if it should operate in transport mode or not. And again, this decision by Google Pay was a proprietary decision, not included in the EMV spec. They just decided on their own, implemented it, and therefore it led to an attack. Another thing we noticed was that after the update, the terminal stopped verifying the signature when it was used in a Visa card transaction. So with this in mind, we built a card emulator that replayed sniffed Visa card certificates and replied with fake EMV messages, essentially creating a fake fabricated card we could use on our own. Using this card, we were able to make any value transactions offline, and we tested it with up to £25,000. It got accepted offline, but naturally, when the terminal connected to the internet, it got rejected because it didn't have any valid cryptographic data. However, this is still a very valid attack because it means that an attacker might have left the merchant's shop by the time that the merchant decided to connect to the internet and see that the transaction gets declined. thus leaving the merchant out of pocket. During the disclosure process with Square, they informed us that the reason that they do not check the SD&D for this specific TTQ value is because some US Visa cards, against the EMV specification, do not send an SD&D when they see the specific TTQ value. So Square, in an attempt to allow for the use of such cards, ended up opening themselves to very serious attacks like this one. Again, this stems from the fact that US Visa implemented something out of spec. Here we can see our attack in action. We set the terminal to £25,000. We use our fake card. And the transaction gets accepted. And we can print the receipt. So in conclusion, in this work, we have identified, investigated, and reverse engineered a number of proprietary features by various parties, leading to numerous attacks. However, the purpose of this work is not to provide a list of attacks, but rather point out that the overloading of EMV messages and the use of proprietary uncoordinated features by a number of stakeholders can lead to vulnerabilities. Hiding your specification behind walls and not having them publicly open with others does not actually help in security. It just leads to further vulnerabilities. And this does not apply just to EMV or just to payments. It's a general issue in cybersecurity. In this work, we have also recommended formally verified fixes to relevant parties. Some have already been implemented, while others are a work in progress. Finally, we hope that some valuable lessons can be learned from this work that can help in improving the security of EMV. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any questions?
Usually there's an additional percentage that the merchant would need to pay depending on the risk profile, such as offline. Did you notice that difference in the offline cases? If the merchant, I'm guessing you work some merchants from India?
The Square readers, I think, have the same payment, online or offline.
Square had the same thing, I see.
But the merchant has to eat more of the risk with offline.
Okay. Okay.
Interestingly enough, there's nothing on Square's website or on Square's system to query a payment. So if someone did buy a car for £25,000 and walk away with it, and it was later rejected by the bank, there's no easy way for Square to say, hey, that was fraud, refund it.
Oh, that's funny.
Not for a shop.
No.
And the merchant can't contact the
Usually
customer either.
banks have that info, they send it to the acquirers or the processors, but
It does, and a Square user could do that out of band through their financial regulators. But there's nothing in the Square account or to query a payment.
Thank you.
What's the legal situation with, like, do you have special cards and special terminals, or?
For the research.
No, it's completely standard cards. So completely standard terminals to our own accounts.
To your own account?
So we're stealing money from ourselves, which in the UK is quite legal. I was very worried that £25,000 transaction was going to go through and make me horribly overdrawn. But yeah, our first set of terminals, we did a lot of transactions and refunded them all. And pretty soon, the terminal owners closed our accounts because we weren't making them any money. But yes, we're very careful only ever to steal money from ourselves, which is perfectly legal in the UK.
And ethical.
Does it count as fraud, like, from the perspective of the, I don't know, whatever sort of merchants it's going through?
That's an excellent question, but no, it doesn't, because we are taking money, we are meaning to take money from ourselves. So when we try and take a large amount of money, when Andrea tried to take £1,000 from her own bank account, she meant to do that. That was the intended transaction. The fact we were bypassing security checks is perfectly legal in the UK. In other countries, bypassing security checks could have been illegal.
If I read you, I don't think the MCA applies
Or CFAA, I guess.
for CFA.
Yeah, so from a protocol viewpoint, that's dreadful, but I'm wondering if EMV provides features to measure the amount of fraud in aggregate, and so that they will know how much of a practical problem it is, if it's actually exploited, or how much fraud there is.
That's a good question.
Have a way of measuring that in their spec? Do they publish some aggregate fraud amount? Or,
EMVCo don't. Individual banks might, but we've recently seen malware start to use this. So we have reports on actual malware where people run farms with lots of stolen phones and cards and relay those to attackers who are going into shops and buying things with them. But unfortunately, we don't have good figures on the total value of this kind of fraud. Yep.
So can you elaborate on this? We have seen malware. So what does seen mean here?
So we have seen reports from malware analysis companies. So we've got some quite nice reports where commercial companies have actually reverse engineered this malware, explained how it's used. There have been some leaks from some server farms. There are some photos of these rows and rows of stolen phones being used as relay. Yep.
How do you reverse engineer the bytes that can you go into the details?
The Apple Advanced Polling, you mean?
Yeah, how do you reverse engineer?
So we collected them from a number of different sources. The code for the London Underground is slightly different from the code for buses. And San Francisco and around the US have these as well. So we can tell which parts identify which. And there's an Apple patent document, which also provides some kind of breakdown. So it's a combination of a patent document and collecting them from different sources and some guesswork. We don't have it properly figured out. If you properly figure it out, you might be able to open all kinds of apps on a locked iPhone.
More questions? No more questions at this point. So let's thank the speakers again.
Thanks.